paranormal literature, there exists a number of cases involving elevators. The vast majority involve people sharing a lift with a perfectly normal-looking man or woman who reveal themselves to be a ghostly entity as the lift reaches its destination. In the case of Canadian Elisa Lam, her bizarre behavior in and around an elevator prior to her strange death, captured on a closed-circuit camera in the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles, has been the impetus for much online debate. Of course, I will not be talking about that case, as I feel there is nothing I could add to it that hasn't already been gone over 1,000 times. Instead, I want to focus on cases involving elevators and high strangeness. Is it possible for people to step onto an elevator in one place only to get off in another place altogether, be it another dimensional reality, possibly another world similar but slightly different than our own? The list of cases I will be talking about suggests yes. December 26, 2016, two people, a man and his brother-in-law, arrived at a busy mall in California to buy a gift for their niece. It was in the afternoon. After driving around, they managed to find a parking spot on the third level of the parking garage. They took the elevator to the ground floor where the toy store was located. After some time, they were able to locate the desired items, a pair of skates that lit up and a dollhouse, and purchased them. They made their way through the haze of Boxing Day shoppers and eventually arrived back at the elevator they had come down on. They climbed inside and pushed the button for level 3. The witness recalled they were exhausted and eager to get back home. As they rode the elevator, everything seemed fine. Then it stopped on the third level, and the door opened, and that's when things got very, very strange. The witness recalled that the parking lot, which should have been filled with cars and people coming and going, was suddenly empty. There were no cars and no people. The brother-in-law seemed unfazed by this and stepped out of the elevator in search of their car. Although sensing that something was strange, the witness decided to follow him anyway. I remember we were not that far from the elevator, but no cars were in the lot, and it looked kind of weird. The lot looked really old, dirty. It stank like old must. There was no garbage or graffiti around. To the witness, the place felt like a crypt. When he pulled out his cell phone, he quickly realized that it was dead. The witness found this odd as he clearly remembered charging it prior to going to the mall. It was at this point he started to become concerned and suggested to his brother-in-law that they should return to the elevator. As his brother-in-law paced about looking for any sign of the car, the witness noticed something odd in the darkness. He described it as a black mass like soot in the corner of the garage furthest from them. To him, it appeared to be moving. This frightened him. They eventually returned to the elevator and pushed the buttons, but the elevator would not move. They stepped out of the elevator and made their way to some stairs which led out of the garage. After a length of time, they managed to find their way to a hallway and another elevator in which they observed shoppers standing around. They had found their way back to the ground floor. Now situated properly, they decided to hoof it up the stairs to level 3 rather than taking the elevator again. Joe was behind me. We took the stairs up to level 3 and found the car right where it was supposed to be. On the way home, Joe was shaking. He said, "What the hell happened to us?" I said, "I don't know. Maybe we just had a moment. I don't know what happened to us." An Ontario woman named Liv M. Pravado wrote of a strange experience she had involving an elevator. This story appeared in an October 1994 issue of Toronto's Midtown Voice. She claims that she was working at a garment company, which was undergoing some renovations. She was on the second floor where the main showroom and offices were. It was situated in an older 5-story building. The third and fifth floor were vacant, while the fourth floor was being used as the storage area for some of their merchandise until the renovations had been completed. Liz had been tasked with retrieving whatever was needed on the fourth floor. Given the age and slowness of the elevator, Liz had decided it was faster to use the stairs. At around 3 o'clock, Liz realized that she had to take her break. Because she was exhausted from running up and down the stairs all day, she decided that she should take the elevator down to the second floor. As she entered it, Liz recalled thinking in her head that she wished the elevator would just break down so she could take a quick nap and not get into any trouble. It was not long after thinking this that things started to get strange. The door clumsily slid open. I started to step out when I noticed that I was on the same floor. I jumped back in and thought to press the button again, on the off chance that I hadn't pressed it hard enough the first time. The door closed, nothing happened. The door opened. I repeated my actions and the door closed again, then opened, then closed. It wouldn't stop. I was so confused. I started pressing all the buttons for all the floors. The door wouldn't stop opening and closing. Eventually, Liz became quite concerned. She yelled for help, but nobody came. There was a lengthy stretch of time, much longer than her allotted break time, in which she was stuck in that elevator. Totally frustrated, Liz recalled speaking aloud, as if to the elevator itself, "I was just kidding. I didn't really mean for you to break down." As if on cue, the elevator settled down. She pressed the door open button and stepped out into the hallway. She stood back and watched as the lights of the elevator lit up. The door closed, and it began its creaky descent to the basement. I came down the stairs thinking that now I would surely be fired because I took so long. I planned to answer the questions of why I was yelling and who I was yelling at upstairs. I walked into the showroom. A couple of customers were browsing. The manager looked up as I walked in. She said nothing. Quickly I said, "Sorry it took me so long." "What do you mean?" she asked curiously. "You were only up there for a few minutes." Liz found this to be very strange, as she was certain that she had been up there for more than a few minutes. Nobody even heard me yelling. It was as if I had been the only person in the building at the time. I had such a strange feeling. Liz found it curious why the elevator had chosen to break down only seconds after thinking it in her head, and then correct itself when she voiced her displeasure. Liz could also not explain the time anomaly or the fact that nobody seemed to hear her despite her screams for help. Regardless of what caused the weird event, Liz felt it best to take the stairs when her shift ended at 5 o'clock. In his book Strange Disappearances, author Brad Steiger discussed the very bizarre case of Miriam Golding. Her story, which was also featured in a 1956 issue of Fate magazine, reads like something out of the Twilight Zone, except way more weirder. It was fall 1934. Miriam and her fiancé were riding a crowded elevator in a Chicago music store. She inadvertently got off on the wrong floor and was unable to get back on before the doors closed. Agitated, Miriam decided it was best to calm down and just wait until the elevator car returned. As she looked around at her surroundings, she was astonished to find that she was no longer in an office building, but rather a large train station. How was it even possible, she wondered. She watched crowds of travelers hurrying about. In the background, she could hear railroad announcers giving times of departures and arrivals. People bought tickets and purchased food from lunch counters. A few were idling patiently in a waiting area. Miriam approached the information booth, but walked away when the girl minding the counter seemed to completely ignore her repeated inquiries. Miriam eventually made her way out of the train station. She recalled seeing what looked like a brand new red brick building across the street. She wandered down the street, watching as people strolled by, nobody taking any notice of her. To her, it was as if she was invisible. Miriam had absolutely no idea where she was, and she began to become concerned. As she walked along, she noticed a blond boy standing on the street, staring in every direction. As she approached him, he acknowledged her. They spoke to each other. Both Miriam and the young man had no idea what was going on, why nobody could see them or where they were. Miriam discovered that the boy was from Lincoln, Nebraska. According to him, he had been playing tennis. He had gone into the locker room to change his shoes. When he came back out, he was no longer standing at the tennis courts, but rather he was inside a large train station, the same one Miriam found herself in. The two of them racked their brains, trying to rationalize how two people, one from Nebraska, the other from Chicago, had wound up at the same train station mere minutes apart. Absolutely nothing made sense. They continued to walk and talk. At some point they found themselves near a field, one in which there was a small body of water. On the other side was a sandbar where a group of girls were standing. As Miriam focused on the girls, she became convinced that one of them was her fiancé's sister. Eventually the girls began to wave at Miriam and her companion. The boy became excited, happy that other people could see them. He wanted to get across and meet up with them. He proceeded to enter the water. He suggested to Miriam that they should just swim across, as it was not that far. "They see us. I know I can make it to them in a few minutes," he told her. Miriam watched as he attempted to swim across. After many minutes, he returned to the shore. He was quite upset. According to the young man, no matter how far across he swam, the sandbar and the girls never seemed to get any closer. It was strange, almost as if he was swimming in place even though he was quite certain he wasn't. As Miriam and the young man talked, they momentarily took their eyes off the girls. When they looked back, they were gone. Miriam and her newfound companion began to realize the seriousness of their situation. Where were they? How did they get there? And would they be trapped there forever? It was then that something came over Miriam, a blackness. She was suddenly completely enveloped in darkness. To her, it felt as though she were floating through space. With a jolt, she found herself on a stool back in the Chicago music store. A magazine was spread out before her. A clock was indicating closing time, and the clerks were giving her nasty looks. It became obvious to Miriam they were waiting for her to leave. She looked around for her fiancé, but he was not there. She purposely avoided the elevator, taking the stairs to get out of the store. When she returned home, her fiancé was waiting for her. He opened the door, apparently quite relieved to see her. He explained that he waited for her on the main floor of the music store and assumed that she had gotten off on the wrong floor and would meet up with him. When she did not show after several hours, he decided to return home, thinking she had the same idea. When Miriam entered the house, she found her fiancé's sister there sitting on the sofa. She indicated to Miriam that she had seen her and the boy while at the sandbar earlier, although that's when things started to get murky. According to the sister, when she saw Miriam and the boy, she and her friends had tried to get their attention to no avail. To them, Miriam and the boy were in deep conversation, and neither one of them had acknowledged them. Of course, this is not how Miriam remembered it. Steiger does not indicate if Miriam and the young boy from Lincoln ever attempted to reconnect afterwards. If the boy from Lincoln actually exists, and he and Miriam actually reconnected, it would certainly go a long way to offer at least some validity to Miriam's story. In my video, The Nightgown, I discussed another case that had similar elements. In that case, a Canadian girl entered the closet of her bedroom only to wind up in the closet of her best friend. She also experienced being enveloped in blackness and the feeling of floating through space. In Miriam's case, there seems to be no easy answers. Was she dreaming, possibly suffering a nervous type breakdown and having a hallucination, or had she and this other person actually slipped through some kind of portal or doorway only to arrive in another plane of existence, one in which they were not visible to other people around them except very briefly by the fiancé's sister and her friends? By that same token, had the fiancé's sister and her friends very briefly looked into another dimension and not even realized it? Far and away one of the strangest and most frightening stories I have ever read about elevators comes from Lon Strickler's blog, Phantoms and Monsters. This case involved a group of school children, an elevator, and a man in black. The woman, who used the initials ES, contacted Lon about something that happened to her in 2001 when she was around 8 years old. This occurred at the New York State Museum in Albany, New York. She was in a group with maybe 2 or 3 other kids. A daycare worker was acting as a chaperone. They had arrived in the morning and were told to roam around the museum with a group until noon, when they had to meet up with everyone for lunch on the 3rd floor. ES recalled that they had actually lost track of time. When they figured it out, they realized they only had a few minutes to get up to the 3rd floor for lunch and attendance. They hurried quickly to the lobby and piled into the elevator. They were out of breath when they made it. They pressed the 3rd floor button, and the chaperone noted that they still had a minute or so to spare. Just as the doors were about to close, an extremely well-dressed man walked into the elevator. He was wearing black shoes, a black suit with a white dress shirt, a black tie, black leather gloves, and a black fedora. He was also carrying a black leather briefcase. At the time I thought nothing of it, but I've always looked back at this and thought this was very odd, as it was summer and he was dressed for the dead of winter. ES noted that as the man got on, he kept his head down, almost as though he didn't want them to see his face. Eventually he turned around, only then lifting his head. He just stood there with his back to us, and I don't remember ever seeing him select a floor. The elevator doors closed, and this eerie feeling seemed to be emanating from the man in black. We had left the lobby on the 1st floor and were going up to the 3rd floor, so the ride should have been maybe 10 or 20 seconds at most. The elevator's display showed we had arrived at the 3rd floor, but the elevator didn't stop. The numbers just kept climbing, and we were definitely still moving. I want to preface this by saying those elevators in the lobby only have access to 4 floors, and to my knowledge the museum only has 4 above ground floors. ES recalled that it was well over a minute since the elevator started moving, and the numbers on the display continued to climb, as did the elevator. That eerie feeling that had been seemingly emanating from this man was getting more intense, and the air in the elevator was beginning to get extremely heavy. This seemed to get more and more noticeable as we continued to go up. The higher the elevator climbed, the feeling turned from eerie to foreboding. I remember getting the feeling in the pit of your stomach when you know something bad is going to happen. Something definitely wasn't right. The display was saying we had passed the 50th floor, and we were still climbing. ES believes that well over 5 minutes passed and the atmosphere in the elevator became almost unbearable. There was a heavy, ominous feeling. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced before or since. The closest thing I can compare it to is that feeling you get when you walk down a dark hallway after watching a horror movie, and even that doesn't begin to describe this. Suddenly the elevator stops. There's a sudden shift in the atmosphere of the elevator. It went from this foreboding feeling to a feeling of impending doom. Then I remember an almost panic when I thought about what was on the other side of those doors. I was telling myself over and over again that the buttons on the elevator don't go past the 4th floor, so there aren't any floors beyond that. So whatever was on the other side of those doors can't possibly exist. This whole experience can't possibly have happened, and when the doors open, I'll see all my friends from the other groups eating lunch and everything will be okay. But that's not what happened. At this point, things started to get fuzzy for ES. I remember getting on the elevator with my group, the man walking in, and the elevator going up, but I can't remember my group being in the elevator after a certain point. I know it was at least 5 minutes from the time we entered the elevator before it stopped, and yet I can't tell you how much time passed between when the elevator stopped and when the doors opened. I remember looking at the display to see what floor we were on, but can't remember what it said. I remember being frozen there with no sound or movement whatsoever. I remember feeling like if those doors opened, something bad was going to happen, to the point where I remember panicking inside my head, pretending that none of this was happening, but every time I opened my eyes, that sinister man was still standing there, as still as a statue. ES next remembers that the man in black suddenly dropped his briefcase onto the floor of the elevator. Not even a second after the briefcase hit the ground, the doors of the elevator opened, and yet I can't remember what was beyond those doors. I have tried for the past 14 years to remember and have never been able to see it. I just remember it being white and bright. The man then calmly picked up his briefcase, tipped his fedora almost as to bid us goodbye, and then walked off the elevator. I then remember the doors closing and that ominous feeling being gone, and in an instant we were on the 3rd floor and the doors popped open. ES next remembers seeing the rest of the group on the elevator. All of them looked just as terrified as she did, especially the chaperone. Looking out, ES saw the rest of the kids and the chaperones from the other groups. They walked out of the elevator and had been expecting to be extremely late for lunch, but somehow they arrived on time. ES couldn't understand this. It was simply impossible. We had initially made it to the elevator a minute or so before lunch started, and that encounter on the elevator had lasted at least 5 or 10 minutes. I remember our chaperone pulling the other adults aside, and I assume told them what happened to us on that elevator. I remember sitting at the table with my friends eating a pizza Lunchable, and the kids from my group and I sharing the story of what had just happened, no one believing us. I remember the chaperone I had avoiding the subject for the rest of the day, and the other kids in my group seemed to have dropped it as well. ES recalled telling her mom about the incident, but felt as though she didn't believe her. Prior to writing Lon, ES contacted her mother to confirm this. I wanted to make sure that really did happen since I was so young and it had been well over a decade since this happened, and that it wasn't something my mind made up over the years, or maybe just a very vivid dream. So I asked my mom if she remembered me telling her about this, and she said she did. She remembers picking me up from the community center, and the second we got into the car, I had told her all about the man in black and the elevator going up all these floors, and even that he had dropped his briefcase. She said she also remembers me telling her that he had said something to me, though she doesn't remember what, and I don't have any memory of him saying anything. ES assumed that it might have been possible that she had gotten on the wrong elevator, which had many floors, although she doubts this as no elevators at the museum go above the 4th floor, as she spent a summer doing catering and had ridden every elevator at the museum. She even considered a gas leak causing them to hallucinate, but found it unlikely. 14 years later, I still have absolutely no clue who that man was, where the elevator took us, what was beyond the doors where the man walked off, or anything that happened in that elevator. I just know that it happened. I have no idea how long we were in that elevator. It could have been minutes or even hours, but what I do know is that time seems to have been separate from our reality, since no time had actually passed when we got to the 3rd floor. There are many aspects of this story that I found compelling. In my video, True But Strange, I discussed a case that occurred in Navarre Beach, in which a group of children experienced high strangeness while attending the screening of the Jodie Foster movie Bugsy Malone. Multiple men in black suits were also sighted by the children during the event, which may have been a mass abduction, a grooming for an abduction, or something else altogether, possibly some type of an experiment. This also reminds me of the nightgown case, most notably the intense fear felt by the witness. In that case, the female witness described feeling something truly horrifying would happen if her friend turned on the bedroom light. This is similar to the feeling felt by ES, the sense of impending doom if the elevator doors were to open. There does seem to be some consistency in these cases. The removal of people from their environment, the ability by whatever is causing this to manipulate time, the sense that something is truly wrong, the feeling of dread and impending doom, and ultimately the lack of answers. Interestingly, all of these cases ended with the witnesses somehow finding their way back to the world they had momentarily left behind. Although it causes me to wonder, is it possible that somebody could step onto an elevator and disappear off the face of the earth? Etobicoke, Ontario, Canada, shortly before 11 a.m. on the morning of July 30th, 1985, 8-year-old Nicole Morin spoke to her friend Jenny, who was waiting downstairs in her building's lobby. Nicole insisted that she be right down. She said goodbye to her mother and exited the apartment and made her way to the elevators. Approximately 15 minutes later, Jenny buzzed the apartment again, wondering why Nicole had not arrived. This time she spoke to Nicole's mother, Jeanette, who confirmed that Nicole had already left and would probably be down shortly. Jenny waited for another 15 minutes for her friend, who never showed. She eventually left the building and made her way to the pool alone. Later that afternoon, Jeanette became concerned when Nicole failed to arrive back at the apartment. By 3 p.m., police were called. This would set into motion one of the most confounding missing persons cases in Canadian history.